The year is 200,000 BC, and conscious apes around the world are all hunting and gathering in tribal obscurity. People's lives are supported and controlled by an extended family they personally know, and once you have food to survive, you have free time to make a little sculpture or dance around a fire, instead of building irrigation trenches or pyramids. Although some people are longing for something more. A future where the average person has a greater choice in food than the most privileged elites in history, without having to chase an animal for hours or accidentally poison themselves trying random berries. But to get there, we're gonna have to stay in one place and dig a lot of holes, which is kind of a tough sell, and there are a lot of resistances to get there. The first of which is the delayed payoff that comes with farming, because while our farmer on the right has been going through trial and error, digging holes, and trying to farm ancient grains, our hunter-gatherer on the left has been making steady progress. But even if you get a farm going, not only are you faced with new problems without context, you now have something worth stealing. Besides the risk involved in committing to farming, you have the conflict between the desire to stick to a natural, nomadic life, or to settle down, work a lot more, and begin the process toward the singularity. Before we get to the singularity, we're gonna have to dig some holes and plant some seeds, which on paper seems pretty hard to do during the ice age that Earth is currently in. Although the word ice age might create an image of an ice-covered Earth, only the northern hemisphere had a significant ice layer expansion compared to modern times. As ice ages start from Earth's natural cycles of tilting on its axis, as well as the direction of Earth's axis changing, resulting in Earth wobbling on its rotational axis, which is a separate cycle from Earth's tilt changing. Finally, you have the cycle of Earth deviating from its normal path of orbit around the sun, causing the northern hemisphere to have cooler summers, which resulted in more ice and snow surviving to the next winter. All of these factors and a few others contributed to the North Pole accumulating more and more ice over time. You might notice that all these cycles are shorter than the most recent ice age, which was 2.5 million years long. To explain why that is, would be an Earth science deep dive. But this video is about the first wave of civilization. So it's 300,000 BC, we're still in an ice age, and the average temperature of Earth is about 10 degrees lower than it is now, a climate in which we became a distinct species. Although evidence of early ancestors of humans are scattered across Africa going back millions of years, for a long time, the earliest bones that scientists claimed were Homo sapien were found in Ethiopia dated to 200,000 BC. But recently, Homo sapien bones have been found in Morocco dated to 300,000 BC. Although it's unclear if these bones represent a fully distinct Homo sapien or a hybrid of other hominid species. For a precise determination on our earliest human ancestor, we turn to genealogy, which has determined that the most recent common human ancestor was a woman in sub-Saharan Africa who lived around 150,000 BC, whose descendants populated sub-Saharan Africa. The reason we know this is because of how resilient mitochondrial DNA from women is in being passed down and tracked generationally. For the next 60,000 years, nothing happens. But around 90,000 BC, due to the cycle that involves the North Pole aiming in a different direction, the Sahara is angled for the most exposure to the sun during perihelion, or when the Earth is closest to the sun, for many years at a time. Ironically, this makes the Sahara so hot that it creates a pressure in Earth's lower atmosphere that attracts evaporated water from the nearby oceans to the Sahara, initiating what is known as an African humid period, which turns the Sahara into a forest every 20,000 years. Despite this happening every 20,000 years, it wasn't until about 90,000 BC when humanity took the opportunity to leave the extremely competitive ecological environment of sub-Saharan Africa, which allowed the first mass migrations of humans out of Africa to populate the rest of Earth, which began the greatest age of human exploration in history. This migration favored going south and following the coast, before we eventually tried migrating north. Then nobody makes any big moves until the most adventurous of us traveled north from Siberia and Asia, climbed ice sheets as tall as 10,000 feet, and traveled through short-faced bear and saber-toothed cat territory to cross the Alaskan ice bridge and populate the Americas, the oldest evidence of which are some clay footprints in New Mexico dated to about 21,000 BC. And by 12,000 BC, evidence appears for humans in Argentina, completing the longest land migration route possible. To celebrate this achievement, Earth has been tilting on its axis, exposing 2.5 million years of glacial buildup to the sun, resulting in a legendary 400-foot increase in sea level.
Hello, how are you? I am under the water Please help me.
The flooding from the Ice Age ending was so legendary that it inspired the oldest stories we have as a species, including the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is literally the oldest written story ever found. These flood legends are included in all of the world's oldest religions that are still practiced today, including Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of these religions feature stories of heroes trying to save humanity and the animal kingdom from apocalyptic floods. To make things even more dramatic, as the Ice Age melt-off was near complete, around 10,800 BC, Earth passes through a meteor stream, causing a bunch of meteors to either explode in Earth's atmosphere or crash into Earth, which coincided with lots of large animals going extinct, and the temperature of the Earth lowering for a period, due to all the dust and ash blocking radiation from the sun, reversing the Ice Age melt-off for a short period. Although the impacts these events had on Earth are agreed on by scientists, the reasons for them are controversial, and the impact these events had on humans is even more controversial, bringing us to the subject of lost Ice Age civilizations. Now, there's a lot of evidence that might suggest lost civilizations existed, whether that be cave cities that were built to hide from meteor storms, or technology which is too advanced for its alleged date. There's a bunch of evidence that Graham Hancock would love to talk to you about. And personally, it seems reasonable that some evidence of civilization might be erased after Earth's sea levels rose by 400 feet and it got battered by meteors. Anyway, I'm just gonna talk about one piece of evidence for lost ancient civilizations, that being a book Plato wrote in 360 BC, where he talks about a story passed down from an ancestor who lived 200 years before him. In that story, Plato's ancestor Solon talks about the time that he visited Egypt and spoke to some priests, and those priests told him about a flood that wiped away a great civilization that happened 9,000 years ago. 9,000 years before the time Solon lived lines up perfectly with the scientifically agreed upon end of the Ice Age. And what was the name of that city? Well, Plato called it Atlantis, probably inspired by the name of the Atlantic Ocean, which comes from the Greek god Atlas, who allegedly held the Earth up by holding the Atlantic Ocean, which was supposed to surround Earth. Where was Atlantis? Well, Plato claimed that not far past the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, there was an island bigger than Africa and Asia combined, which is definitely not true. If Atlantis was anywhere, it would be in northwest Africa, as it is highly likely that Ice Age floods scraped off any evidence of civilization that may have been there. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that humanity's progression towards civilization began after the Ice Age ended, which didn't take long because shortly after the Ice Age ended, construction begins on Göbekli Tepe, the oldest large building we've found so far. Because there's no evidence of housing to support the construction of Göbekli Tepe near the site, and because tens of thousands of random animal bones have been found near the site, and because no concrete evidence of farming has been found before this time, the accepted view is that Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. So why are these hunter-gatherers spending all of that energy on building a cool rock building instead of getting a head start on world domination? Probably because Göbekli Tepe, like many other similar sites in the region, was a spiritual hub that many surrounding bands of hunter-gatherers contributed to. And in the process of that contribution, they were experimenting with the revolutionary concept of a wider society, working together for a common cause. The pre-pottery Stone Age was characterized by experiments like Göbekli Tepe, culminating in the first real city, Çatalhöyük, with an estimated peak population of 10,000 people living an agricultural lifestyle. It's interesting to note that Çatalhöyük's homes were mostly identical, suggesting an anarcho-communist culture, resembling hunter-gatherer society. Despite reaching a population in the thousands, the people of the city never invented writing in the 1400 years of its inhabitation. And then people had fun for a few thousand years, making increasingly cool pots, until the people who made these pots, called the Sumerians, invented writing roughly in 3500 BC, shortly followed by the Egyptians' hieroglyphs, and then a bit later, the Indus Valley people's Harappan script. That's the short and sweet textbook answer. Here is a granular, categorized answer on who invented writing. Harappan script is still undeciphered, so we're not going to talk about it much. All of these cultures were conveniently positioned next to fertile rivers along the densest path of human migration in the Stone Age. And with the invention of writing, history begins. Although the Egyptians and Sumerians started out with pictographic, emoji-like written languages, they would both create new iterations of these language scripts that were easier to write and more linear. The difference being the Sumerians would abandon their pictographic proto-writing by 2900 BC, while the Egyptians would continue using hieroglyphs as a sacred language for thousands of years, mainly in temples and religious texts, making it the only pictographic written language to flourish to this extent. Instead, they chose to maintain a second writing system for everyday purposes, called hieratic, written on papyrus leaves using various mineral pigments and oils, while cuneiform was written by indenting soft clay with a stylus and heating it. The Egyptians maintained two different number systems for hieroglyphs and hieratic as well, both being base 10 number systems as opposed to the Sumerians' base 60 number system. Agricultural methods like controlling a river's flooding had enabled food surpluses, uncapping society's population and enabling some part of the population to focus on developing high-skill labor, like being a scribe, engineer, or people controller. With the gap in individuals' value in society widening, combined with society's assets rolling over generationally in a way they hadn't before, came the advent of kings, countries, war, and massive monuments to powerful guys' egos, marking the beginning of the end to the social structures we've had since being a distinct species. So what are the big differences between Sumer and Egypt? Well, for one, Egypt was an actual country, the first country in history at that, while the Sumerians were a bunch of independent city-states, united by a shared culture and ambition for civilization. Secondly, the Egyptians had the better river, as it flooded so reliably that the 365-day calendar we use was developed to track the Nile's flooding, while the Tigris and Euphrates has historically been more erratic, to the point I need to draw this rough overlay to show where the river used to be. Third, Egypt was basically an oasis surrounded by desert and natural choke points. This meant that the Egyptians didn't have to worry about hunter-gatherer warrior raiding parties as much as the Sumerians, as there wasn't as much migration flow in their region. For some more tangible comparison between the cultures, here are both cultures' earliest creative masterpieces, dated to effectively the same time. On one hand, the Narmer palette depicts the first pharaoh Narmer uniting North and South Egypt by decapitating a bunch of people, while the Warka vase depicts a more grounded hierarchy of life, with crops at the bottom, then livestock, then humans, and then humans presenting those crops and livestock to the gods. It's telling that the Egyptians' masterwork centers around the ruler of Egypt, while the Sumerians focuses more on the collective hierarchy of society. Because although both cultures were polytheistic, the Egyptians believed their ruler was a literal god, while the Sumerians believed their leader was just a conduit for God. This difference in social class likely applied at all levels, as there is a greater difference in burial tributes in ancient Egyptian graves compared to Sumerian, suggesting Egypt was a more socially stratified society. You can't keep getting away with it! With all of this in mind, here's my big picture take on these two cultures. The Egyptians were blessed with a more reliable river that is effectively an oasis surrounded by harsh terrain, reducing the amount of raiding parties, which combined with a more stable crop yield gave the ruling class of Egypt the breathing room to call themselves gods, build the tallest buildings / tombstones in the world, and invent the Illuminati. Meanwhile, the Sumerians were constantly threatened by external forces, creating a more egalitarian and pragmatic society that invented and adopted technology faster than the Egyptians, out of necessity rather than curiosity. Basically, Egypt was privileged and decadent, where the Sumerians were gritty and resourceful. Nothing highlights this difference better than what's going on in both cultures around 2700 BC. What happened between then and 3000 BC? Nobody really knows. It's the early dynastic period. Here is a quick summary. The elites of North and South Egypt were probably fighting over who is really in charge. In the end, the South won. We know this because of the Narmer palette, which depicts the first pharaoh Narmer wearing the crown of South Egypt while in battle. But in the side depicting his victory, he is shown wearing the northern crown. Despite this, the capital was placed in Memphis, likely as a sign of good faith, or maybe a keep your enemies closer thing. Meanwhile, Sumerian city-states are working on their own problems independently. The only thing that is clear in this period is that the first legendary person in history, Gilgamesh, existed in this time. He was apparently really cool, as he's always shown wrestling a lion. Gilgamesh led the awakening of Sumerian culture from the city of Uruk, where he allegedly had a big wall constructed. Anyway, it's 2700 BC, and the Egyptians seem to have ironed out the whole theocratic dictatorship thing, based on one of the earliest translated hieroglyphs from this pharaoh's tomb. 2 high evidence pharaohs later, Pharaoh Djoser begins construction on the first of many pyramids, beginning Egypt's first golden age known as the Old Kingdom, or the Age of the Pyramids. And there were a lot of pyramids, starting with Djoser's pyramid, which is pretty cool, but then his ancestors let him down, allowing Snefru to start the 4th dynasty and build 3 pyramids, probably by taking taking a lot of slaves from nearby regions according to the Palermo stone. But really we're here for the Great Pyramid of Giza, aka Khufu's Pyramid, which was completed only 200 years after we find complete translated sentences in hieroglyphs. There's a lot to talk about with this pyramid, but let's just start by doing some math on how much fricking work it took to build this pyramid. So this is the average granite block size of the upper and lower section of the pyramid. Let's make a crude average dimension of 1 by 1.75 by 1 meter granite block. Now you have to carve that stone out. How?
We have technology!
By smashing granite with a dolerite rock, of course, like this. But you have to carve out space for you to work too. Based on the average trench width of the unfinished obelisk quarry in Aswan of 0.75 meters, here are the volume calculations in cubic meters of the combined trench size for one block, adding up to 4.125 cubic meters. I found this YouTube video of these guys testing how much granite they could shave off with a dolerite rock in an hour, and they got 311 cubic centimeters. So at that rate, it would take 13,263 hours to carve out one block of granite. How many blocks are in Khufu's pyramid? 2.3 million. But granite was mostly used for the internal chambers of the pyramid. But the majority of the pyramid is made of limestone, which on the Mohs scale of hardness is a 3 compared to granite's 6. So let's call the mining rate double what it is for granite. Okay, so that gives us 15.2 billion hours of pounding limestone. Assuming a workforce of 100,000 people working 365 days a year in 12-hour shifts, it would take 34.8 years just to carve out the stone. Is it too late to go back to being hunter-gatherers? Yes, alright. And that's excluding dislodging the stone, lifting it up, getting it to the construction site, etc. Did I mention a lot of the granite and limestone had to be transported miles to the construction site? How? Well, the least controversial theory is that they drag the stones along wet sand. Or they may have tied filled animal hides and wood to the stones and floated them down the Nile. These theories seem plausible for the standardized 2.5 ton cube size I'm working off, but it gets complicated when you try and consider how they managed to transport and place the 80-ton granite stones above the pharaoh's chamber. As you might expect, there are a lot of conspiracy theories on how the pyramids were built. Was it aliens? Was it forgotten ancient vibration technology?
Resonance frequencies. Everything vibrates.
Was the pyramid itself a harmonic vibration energy power plant? Will I do a deep dive on any of this? Nope. Alright, one last conspiracy thing. Why is there a helicopter on these hieroglyphs? Alright, back to the real, accepted, legitimate narrative. The Great Pyramid was completed in 2570 BC without the use of slave labor according to these sources, and complete with a white alabaster casing and a golden cap, which has unfortunately been looted over the years. Standing at 481 feet tall, the Great Pyramid held the record for the tallest human construction for almost 4,000 years, before being beaten by the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311. But what's debatably even more impressive is the math and science knowledge embedded in the pyramid. Great Pyramid's corners are almost perfectly aligned to the cardinal points. If you take half of the perimeter of the pyramid's base and divide it by the pyramid's height, you get something very close to pi. The ratio of the slant height of the pyramid to half the base dimension is extremely close to the golden ratio. If you divide the slant angle by the vertex angle times 2 of the pyramid, you get Euler's number. Very cool, but nobody seems excited at the time. Despite ordering the construction of the only remaining ancient wonder, this is the best statue we can find of Khufu.
Look at this dude. Wait till you see the...
There are very few contemporary writings about him. The ones that have been found don't give too much context. While from the same period, the Sumerian hero Gilgamesh had a whole book written about how awesome he was. And he didn't even build a pyramid. This lack of evidence for Khufu's legacy could be for a few reasons. First, his chamber in the Great Pyramid is likely the densest artifact source, and unfortunately it's been picked clean long before modern archaeologists could get to it. Second, the Old Kingdom temples that likely would contain detailed accounts of his rule have been destroyed, maybe by nature, maybe intentionally, bringing me to my third reason. Maybe Khufu and his descendants were hated by the Egyptian people for directing so much labor towards a vanity project like this, while Gilgamesh's big project was building walls around the city of Uruk to defend his people. The oldest interesting and colorful commentary on Khufu and the 4th dynasty comes from Greek intellectuals like Herodotus 2,000 years after the pyramid's construction. While Herodotus is definitely a questionable source, the ancient Greeks were big-time Egypt weebs, so at the very least I trust that Herodotus was knowledgeable about the rumors of the time. From Herodotus we get the claim that the Egyptians didn't like to talk about Khufu and his descendants, as they named the pyramid after some random shepherd they knew. We also get the claim that Khufu and his grandson Khafre closed the temples from public worship and were allegedly nothing but evil. But Khufu's grandson Khafre, who built a slightly smaller pyramid, and allegedly the Sphinx, has a surviving, pristine, contemporary sculpture, as well as Khufu's great-grandson Menkaure, who built the Pyramid of Menkaure. Being the guy who built the biggest pyramid, it would make sense that he would take the brunt of the outrage. By the way, using the same math from earlier, just carving out the stones for all the 4th Dynasty pyramids adds up to 47.7 billion work hours. If you compare the 4th Dynasty pyramids with every pyramid constructed after the 4th Dynasty, it's clear pyramid building fell off. Although pyramid building continued, they were made smaller and with much lower quality materials like mud brick, which has been destroyed by the elements. This could be due to the backlash the 4th Dynasty received, or it could be because the 4th Dynasty led the country during the apex of its centralized power, which they used to plant a flag that signaled to Egyptians, foreigners, and the gods that Egypt is real and here to stay. Considering the false starts of the first dynasties, it makes sense why this message was needed at the time. But the pyramids weren't just symbolic proof that the first country had arrived, they were practical evidence that Egypt's district and tax systems could be relied on for tens of thousands of people to contribute wheat, stone, and labor towards a building they'll never see and a guy they'll never know. At least everybody's working towards the same goal, which set the Egyptians up to be the first to trade at scale on the Mediterranean.
It's free real estate.
So while Egypt has been centralizing, building pyramids, and flourishing without competition, the Sumerians have been fighting the first recorded war in history with the Elamites, who are the newest cultural region to buy into farming, living in cities, and writing. Like the Sumerians, the Elamites based their writing system on indenting clay and heating it, although their writing system likely developed a few hundred years after cuneiform. And their water supply was much worse, which contributed to them being behind on farming. In terms of spoken languages, the Sumerians and Elamites both spoke language isolates, meaning languages that developed in isolation that have no relatives. Unlike the Semitic peoples, who spoke a language with many variations that would influence many ancient civilizations and go on to survive today. Any modern understanding of Semitic people isn't that helpful here. At this point, the Semitic people is a term that encompasses pretty much everybody in Mesopotamia who isn't farming, and everybody in the Arabian Peninsula. But they weren't your average aimless hunter-gatherers. They were a network of nomads that brought livestock and whatever they could tie on their camel's back with them, and they probably linked up for festivals, where they reaffirmed a general language and culture. Obviously, there are a lot of differences between Semitic tribes, but the mythological ideal of the Semitic people was a nomadic shepherd culture that was uneasy about participating in agricultural civilization. Although the Semitic people, like everybody else at the time, were polytheistic, they seemed interested in having less gods in comparison to the Egyptians and Sumerians, who seemed to drop a new god every month, which would eventually lead to the monotheistic Abrahamic religions. But that's way in the future. As of 2700 BC, the Semitic people are circulating around, living a kind of hunter-gatherer plus lifestyle, while the Semitic people who were most eager to participate in urban society were rejected by the Egyptians, but welcomed by the Sumerians. And so, over time, more and more Semitic peoples migrated into Sumerian cities, in particular in northern Sumer. Back to the Sumerian-Elamite conflict. The eastern Sumerian cities are using their newfound organization to bully and loot the Elamites, a conflict which would produce the oldest written evidence of war in history. As from the Sumerian kings list, we get a victory attributed to the king of Kish at the time over the Elamites. So the more eastern Sumerian cities are getting juiced up on Elamite loot, which coincided with a power shift in Sumerian city-states. During the Uruk period, in which Sumerian culture was born and spread from the Sumerian core of culture, Uruk, cities were preoccupied with their own problems, and so they mostly peacefully traded with each other. But now in the early dynastic period, enough Sumerian cities have organized themselves to the point where farmlands are starting to encroach on one another. This, combined with an influx of war loot, created a situation where the Sumerian kings are getting a bit uppity. They used to be able to get off on having just one city. Now they want more. And so more and more conflicts between Sumerian city-states would start, to the point where war with the Elamites had to be put on hold. Of these conflicts, the most important was between Umma and Lagash, whose rivalry would be the highlight of the early dynastic period, which would produce the oldest written peace treaty, a stone cone that was placed in the earth in between their borders, along with a whole bunch of evidence of negotiations, water and property rights, etc. Although this paperwork ended up being disregarded, as they would continue fighting each other anyway while everyone else played both sides, until Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma manages to beat their long-standing rival of Lagash. Then he goes on a victory lap all around Sumer, and by 2350 BC, Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma manages to unite all of Sumer for the first time, placing the capital of Sumer in the first Sumerian city, Uruk. Interestingly, the kings of Lagash have have been excluded from the Sumerian kings list, which could be an example of the victor writing history. All this time, the Semitic people had become an increasingly strong influence in the region, particularly in northern Sumer. After hundreds of years of integration, by 2300 BC, only shortly after Sumer had been unified by a native ruler, Semitic influence in the region had reached such a level that the legendary Semitic figure Sargon of Akkad shows up and conquers all of Sumer as an illegitimate child born to nothing, which is pretty unheard of at this time. Sargon would go on to conquer the Elamites, along with various Semitic tribes who were beginning to start their own thing, resulting in the first empire in history. This is a pretty crazy territory expansion, especially given the time, but the Western conquest was likely just steamrolling small urban communities getting on their feet. Because of the Western territory's low levels of organization, evidence that the Akkadians held the striped section is spotty. At the very least, they came in and did a mix of pillaging and establishing favorable trade routes. In the case of the Elamites, evidence is strong that the Akkadians conquered them, as the native Elamite writing system was replaced with Akkadian cuneiform, which is basically Sumerian cuneiform but written top to bottom instead of left to right, and with some changes to accommodate the grammar of Semitic languages. It wasn't just the Elamites who adopted Akkadian. As Akkadian was the language of trade in the empire, Akkadian and the concept of writing spread further and further, likely inspiring people on the fringes of civilization to aspire to more in their own communities. But the enlightenment of the human race was probably secondary to controlling the healthiest trade network in the world, which connected the entire cradle of civilization. Although, this expansion in trade was largely for the purpose of trading for tin, as it's not the Stone Age anymore. It's been the Bronze Age for 1,000 years, and bronze is 90% copper, which is relatively easy to get, and not that hard to melt with primitive methods, and 10% tin, which is even easier to melt, but much more rare. Because of the accessible melting point of copper, literate peoples have been smelting copper for thousands of years, typically adding arsenic to the copper to produce a bootleg bronze without tin, typically made with a modified campfire, in comparison to the advanced kilns used by the Akkadians to control the temperature and shape of the material. The greatest advantage of bronze weapons over stone weapons isn't the fact that they hurt more when you hit someone with it, but the fact that they're much less likely to break in combat. In civilian life, bronze meant that farm tools could last generations, which probably boosted economic productivity a decent amount. With Elamites under the Akkadians' control, one of the densest sources of tin in the region, in the Iranian plateau, was available to the Akkadians, allowing them to produce and distribute the highest density of quality bronze up to this point. This would be great if they had a local rival to use this advancement against, or if they could sell bronze tools in bulk to a foreign buyer like Egypt. Unfortunately, Egypt isn't fighting any wars, and the Akkadians' greatest threat isn't an established civilization, but various illiterate, aggressive, nomadic raiding cultures who would rob trading caravans and pillage farmlands, only to disappear to some nondescript resting place, resulting in a kind of Vietnam guerrilla warfare scenario the Akkadians were not prepared for. When you think about it, there are three paths a primitive hunter-gatherer culture might take. First, you can focus on your next meal and getting along with the 20 or so people you know in the world, living in harmony with our natural roots, and avoiding complex social problems entirely, in which case you aren't going to be mentioned in history. Second, you can focus on ideas and dreaming about what is possible, whether that manifests in new technologies, social systems, etc., in which case you likely would have migrated to Sumer or Akkad already and integrated. Third, you can avoid this complex headache of building an urban society and instead just steal the fruits of other people's labor. The enemies the Akkadians faced at this point were largely in Group 3, namely the Amorites, who were a Semitic culture known for their rugged attitude and violence. For context on who the Amorites were, I've got this old Sumerian love story about a Sumerian woman who was promised to a Sumerian man, but who ultimately chose an Amorite.
He is clothed in sack leather, lives in a tent, exposed to wind and rain, and cannot properly recite prayers. He lives in the mountains and ignores the places of gods, digs up truffles in the foothills, does not know how to bend the knee, and eats raw flesh. He has no house during his life, and when he dies he will not be carried to a burial place. My love, why would you marry a Meru?
And to the east, the Akkadians were getting raided by the Gutians. Unlike the Amorites, the Gutians were an Indo-European peoples. The term I'll explain when it's more relevant. Because the Gutians' culture went extinct without developing their own writing system, or learning to read and write at any kind of scale, little is known about them, but they came down from the mountains to the east to raid as the Amorites did from the west. Finally, there were the the Elamites, who were likely the greatest threat as they were a Type 2 culture whose sovereignty had been taken from them. On top of this, there's evidence that the greater region went through a drought at this time. In the end, despite having likely the first professional standing army, a world-class education, banking, legal, and trade system, the Akkadians succumbed to the pressure. As the Mongols proved thousands of years later, having low living standards and being evasive and rugged is a better force multiplier than most things before gunpowder and crossbows, as all these factors led to the Akkadian Empire collapsing in 2154 BC after a short 150 years of existence, leading to a period of chaos and violence in the region, while the Elamites restored their cultural region. While the civilizations of Mesopotamia suffered from too much competition, the Egyptians were suffering from too little competition, as the ruling class continued to find new ways to waste their great national wealth. One of the most ridiculous ways this was done was through mortuary temples dedicated to pharaohs as a place for future generations to continue to worship them. A lot of stone was used to build these temples, but that's not what made them a strain on Egypt's economy. What did make them a strain was the maintenance, ritual sacrifices, and long list of staff that had to be paid and fed for their service. Hieroglyphs needed repainting, new offerings of rare materials had to be brought to the deceased pharaoh consistently, and those who worked at the temple had to be compensated for their service. This would be fine if there wasn't an ever-growing list of dead pharaohs that needed to be indefinitely honored, and by the end of the Old Kingdom, this list of mortuary temples had gotten so long that even the great national wealth of the Nile couldn't keep up. This combined with a quickly growing amount of priests, which spread the pharaoh's central legitimacy across the country, created a situation which was ripe for rebellion. Top of all this, the Egyptians were affected by the same drought that the Akkadians were, which was the last straw that ended the Old Kingdom, and a collapse of central power in Egypt. Although the resulting violence was likely much less than what followed in the former Akkadian Empire. So it's 2130 BC, and the project of civilization is going through a lull. Check out part 2 for a more literate and internationally connected ancient world.